Our next presenter is Josie Lee, who is HoChunk. She has a master's degree in museology from the University of Washington and is a bilingual educator. She was employed at the Hibald Cultural Center and the Burke Museum and is now the founding director of the HoChunk Museum. Please help me welcome Josie.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Joe. Thank you to my panelists, their fellow panelists, and everyone that is here. Thank you to the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians for allowing me to be here today. Hangshi Najiwa Hingaire, Chaya Kikara Chwanakshana. Hiuni Hara, Rekumaniga Hingaire, Hianch Hara, Tobiga Higaire. Hichoke Hara, Chaskaga Higaire, Wanachire. Hikroke Hara, Hyunginga Hingaire, Wanachire. My name is Josie Lee, and I'm a member of the HoChunk Nation. And in my very quick introduction of HoChunk, I gave you a background of who I am as a person, my parents, my grandparents, so that if you were HoChunk and in my community, you would be able to place me within my world. This information might tell you how to address me as a person or how I might address you. And that's really important when I begin. So in general, I am a woman of many, many hats. I'm an independent curator. I am a consultant, a wife, a mother, a daughter, a doctoral student, and I am currently the museum director for the HoChunk Nation Museum and Cultural Center. So I was going to start by asking if anybody had any clue about who HoChunks were, but thankfully, my fellow panelist was able to give a little introduction of who our people are. But this right here is our territory. So on the left, you can see where HoChunk lands extend to on a modern-day map. And on the right, you will see a little bit of background information about who our tribal members are today and where we are located. So the HoChunk Nation is one of the few tribes within the US without a reservation. This means that we don't have a contiguous land base, but instead we are spread out between 13 separate communities in 26 counties in 3 separate states. Our communities range from Green Bay, Wisconsin to Minneapolis, down along the I-94 corridor, all the way to Chicago. These spots, again, are also part of our ancestral homelands, which the government itself tried to remove us unsuccessfully from 11 times. My role as a representative of my people's story, again, requires me to balance the needs of 13 different communities across 26 counties in 3 different states. Each of these communities have their own unique stories. They have their own way of understanding our tribal worldview. They have their own understanding of our tribal politics, all of which is really important to each of us. So oftentimes I have to find the commonalities and also celebrate the differences. And if anybody knows things about HoChunk people, we are very, very stubborn and very proud of ourselves. For example, many of our communities made baskets. And at one point in time, you could tell the specific communities apart by the way that they made them. It might be the shape that the baskets were made. The maker might be able to be told just from the colors of the baskets. And had I thought about this example ahead of time, I would have included some in the slides. Another example is the way that each community still holds on to our different dialects of language. So for my family, we use the word kaka to describe our grandmother, but for my husband's family, they use the word gaga. And they mean the same thing, but it's just the way that dialects have held on. And then one of my favorite examples is the way that the families living in our communities in the 1880s are still the families that live within these communities today. So the HoChunk Nation has been trying to build a museum for our people since 1963. It was in fact written into our Constitution when we formed as a federal recognized tribal government. But the idea itself faced a lot of criticism, and you can see an example here of why people did not want to see our items within a museum. So it meant that I had to be really, really creative in trying to convince the community of why it was important to tell our story in our own words, in our own facility. First, I held a summer youth program with middle school students to teach them object photography and label writing. It was the most fun experience I've ever had. We played Pokemon Go in order to get them all their wiggles out. And for each student, they wrote about their identity and what was important to them. These students went on to then speak before a tribal legislator a year later to advocate not only for themselves, but for their teacher that they wanted to keep on staff. And I really like to believe that I helped them find the power in their voice before they did that. That summer youth program led into pop-up museums. So these were events that were held in some of our different communities, but not all of them. Because I never expected tribal members to drive to me, I drove to them, which meant, again, going through that whole big map. I was provided food and drinks and hopefully a welcoming environment. These pop-up events invited our community members to bring an object from home that was significant to them and fit within a theme. And it's a little blurry there, but one of our first themes was, what does this object mean to you about your identity? So participants, again, brought an item, created a label, and then they shared if they were comfortable with other guests. And these events themselves initially had really small participants, but hugely meaningful impacts. Oh gosh, these are so blurry. On the left are some of our participants, and on that table was a ton of photos that somebody brought from their family collection. And they were so excited because that was the first time they were able to show them off to our community. And the best part is that each of those people there standing above that table were able to identify people from our community and their past. They were able to identify their relatives and family friends and share stories about who those people were. And many of those stories had never been shared in our community. And if they were, it had been 50 years since they had seen them. The next, again, that's just on the right is an example. I'm sorry, this is so bad. The pair of shoes in the front were actually inspired by the moccasins that were shown within Patricia's slides. Okay, there we go. After the pop-up museum success, I helped to initiate culture camps through the Department of Heritage Preservation. These camps sought out expert artists and knowledge keepers within our community to show off their skills through demonstrations and tables that highlighted their work. This is just one of our camps. They were held seasonally because our calendar doesn't, or our activities don't stay the same just because it's our homeland. Each thing changes as the seasons progress. So this format itself allowed visitors to make connections with the skilled teachers within our community. When these started, the need and the hunger within our community for learning our traditional arts was huge, but the museum itself didn't have its own permanent space. Instead, it was solely an idea. We had a handful of people that were making certain items and gathering specific foods, but now, after these camps, we're seeing a growing number of people learning and teaching others. We have hosted hide tanners, lacrosse stick makers, lacrosse games, foraging, basket makers, beadworkers, yarn belt weavers, storytellers, and more. We've even held Indigenous food cook-offs during these events, and they provide a fully immersive experience for our visitors. And those experiences not only highlight our artistic aesthetic, but also our culinary and ethnobotanical expertise. In fact, our own Elena Terry was featured on Andrew Zimmer's Family Dinner, highlighting our foods just last year. So, the success of these programs, showcasing our voice in our community, allowed for the opening of our museum. And we first opened our doors to the public in January 2020. With the expertise of HoChunk artist Tom Jones, we opened with a show of watercolors by HoChunk artist Clarence Monager Wanahede. When our museum opened, it was important to me and our guest curator to show HoChunk work that did not rely solely on stereotypes, although we have gotten tons and tons of requests for beadwork and projectile points since then. This show of Monager's work was only the second show of solely his work in 50 years. And that right there is his daughter, Mona, and this was the first time she had been able to see a show of his work. So not only was this an important moment for his family, but it was also an important moment for burgeoning HoChunk artists. It showed them that there are many different ways of expressing an HoChunk interpretation of the world. So as you know, 2020 was kind of a horrible year. And shortly after opening, we closed our doors. In fact, all of HoChunk businesses were closed, and over half of our tribal employees were laid off as a result, and myself included in that. During this time, I continued to work and build new contracts with a number of area institutions, and I began to start focusing on the ways that we tell the HoChunk stories through them. These places included the La Crosse County Historical Society, Milwaukee Public Museum, the Field Museum, Wisconsin Historical Society, and a handful more. It was important to me that through each of these projects, that the past stories of HoChunk ingenuity, brilliance, and fortitude be a part of the continued narrative of who we are today. On November 29th, 2020, our museum and collections suffered extreme water damage after a fire broke out in the building next door. Although there were no employees of the museum at the time, through the back-breaking work of our community, not only were we able to remove all of our collections from 4 feet of water, but we were able to save every piece of our collection, minus 2 pieces of paper. So 150 volunteers came together, and most of them were tribal members. And they helped with 2 weeks of drying and triage for our collection. And I just want to, again, point out how important it was that 150 tribal members came together in the midst of a pandemic that was hitting our community very hard. If it weren't for our tribal community coming together immediately and providing longer alternatives for care, none of this would have been possible. And if it weren't for the connections I had made with our surrounding institutions, again, none of this would have been possible. The Field Museum was one of the first groups to send photography and object conservators to help. And again, you can see where we were drawing there. One of our youth centers was closed for kids, so we were able to make use of their gym space. So even though the museum is currently closed to the public, it doesn't mean that my work ends. Most of my work through my official capacity these days is juggling contractors and making sure that we are prioritizing the needs of not just the museum, but our tribal government and the city government as well. And we really want to welcome visitors again, but we can't do that without ensuring visitor safety first. Again, our doors will open again in due time. But for now, it's just a building, waiting for the needs of our people to come first. We spent a year without our ceremonies, and we stopped our gatherings. And our people are slowly starting to return, but we need to prioritize safety first. If our museum is dedicated to being a place of honor for our community, both past and present, we cannot do that if our community doesn't come first. The HoChunk Nation was fortunate enough to find ways to provide medical supplies to families, along with weekly food distributions, and much more during a really trying time. And I don't want to toot our horn too much, but HoChunk is really great. As I mentioned before, I'm a woman of many hats, and I work with a number of area institutions. Institutions all around the Midwest are beginning to recognize that they have not represented our communities in very favorable lights. Oftentimes, they're unknowingly reinforcing harmful stereotypes about our peoples. Many of these places when they call me in, they don't know how to work with tribes. So a lot of my work starts with hand-holding and a little bit of educating. And I do a lot of background teaching about who we are as a people before they can even begin to approach our community. And I have to make sure that they are doing this respectfully before they go in, because it can be disastrous. So I have to be encouraging while also being stern, having to constantly remind these places that things don't happen overnight, especially when the community doesn't know you. It's reminding them that museums have historically exploited our communities, and unless you are willing to put in long-term work, there might never be a working relationship. Once that is established, then I can begin my role of balancing the expectations of non-tribal institutions with the stories that our community wants shared. One exhibition that I'm currently working on with the Historic Indian Agency House in Portage is working to connect the stories of the past to family stories today. So the Historic Indian Agency House was built in the early 1800s and served for the annuity site or annuity payments for tribal members in 1833. So it's only highlighting 1 year in the past, but those events are tied to things 190 years later. So this part on the right is part of the new exhibit space that is going up, highlighting some of our traditional village sites and connecting them to the families who still live there today. Another place I'm working with is ready to make their community uncomfortable. And honestly, I don't know if the museum or the community is ready for that. In the Midwest, we have a thing called being Midwest nice, but oftentimes it serves as a buffer for silencing voices, especially those of BIPOC people. It pushes problems under the rug with a facade of nicety, and oftentimes museums have shown a singular focus of vanishing Indians to visitors, and if they updated their work, it was done in the early 1990s. So much can change within a decade, and so much can change even in a year. The narrative in these spaces is so passive. It removes the burden of the visitor to separate themselves from the past. So they no longer have to associate the things that were done in the past to our people with who we are today. They're not a part of that narrative if they only see a passive voice. So that is part of why I worked on this map for the Field Museum. We chose not to use the word removal for our military escorts from our homeland. Instead, we put the action back on the United States government and eager homesteaders for the atrocities that were done to my people. This map ends with a call to action to museum goers to speak up against injustices of people of color and to encourage them to be familiar with federal Indian policy because it affects them too. And I have to be honest, at this point, I'm really tired of talking about removals because our story is so much more than just a horrific 50-year period. And I don't want you to get me wrong. Our story is not all sunshine and rainbows. Our past has been tough, but I live in a gilded age of HoChunk life, and we're ready to share our story. We want to highlight our storytellers, our scholars, our weavers, our carvers, and our culture keepers. We want people to come to our home to know who we are and where we have been, but we also want them to dream with us about the future we see for ourselves. I consider myself extremely fortunate. As part of my work, I get to help push forward the stories that are important to my community. I get to explore topics of culture, meaning behind stories, and artistic expression. I have the extreme honor of being able to learn from our elders, and I have the privilege of listening to, learning from, and passing on the stories of hardship, forced removals from our homeland, genocide, and boarding school. But I also have the privilege of hearing the stories about the most intense love for our people, the love for our language, our home, and our way of life. And I've been trusted enough to be one of the people that helps to make sure that all the many facets of who we are as HoChunk people is passed along to the next generation. If I didn't love my community and my community didn't love me back, I wouldn't be able to do the work that I do. Pinagigui.
Whew. Thank you, Josie. That was really great.